Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the show where we break down the latest and greatest in academic research. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita. Okay, so let's jump right in. Today we're taking a deep dive into Buy Now, Pay Later.
BNPL.
BNPL,
Yeah.
exactly. And we're going to really explore how those tempting little installment payments might be affecting your spending habits.
It's fascinating stuff.
It is. You sent over some seriously interesting research on this, excerpts from a study by Maesen and Eng.
Oh yeah, that one. It was just published this year in the Journal of Marketing.
So fresh off the press, really cutting edge stuff. Before we get into the details, can you give us a super quick overview of BNPL for anyone who maybe isn't totally familiar?
Sure. So the most common model you'll see is paying in 4 interest-free installments over 6 weeks.
Okay, so like 6 weeks to pay off a purchase, essentially.
Right. And it's grown like crazy. I mean, we're talking 380 million users globally just this year.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
It is. And that number is projected to almost double by 2028.
So almost 700 million people using BNPL in just a few years.
Pretty much. And global spending is expected to hit a whopping $450 billion by 2027.
Wow, those are some serious numbers.
Yeah, it's becoming a major force in retail.
For sure. And I feel like it's everywhere these days. Every major retailer seems to be offering it. I've seen it on ASOS, Adidas, H&M, even Walmart and Sephora.
Yeah, right. It's gone totally mainstream.
This brings us to the big question that this study is trying to answer. Does using BNPL actually make you spend more money?
Well, based on their analysis, the answer is a pretty clear yes.
Really?
Yeah. They found a link between using BNPL and both how often people buy things and the total amount they spend.
Okay, so not just buying more frequently,
Yeah,
but also spending more in each purchase.
exactly.
So was this just like a temporary thing? Maybe people overspent initially when they first started using BNPL and then kind of adjusted their habits? Or was it a longer lasting effect?
That's what's really interesting. The changes in spending behavior actually continued for the full 26 weeks after people started using BNPL.
Wow, so almost 6 months of consistently spending more.
Yep. No buyer's remorse here, apparently.
It really makes you think about whether those convenient payments are really as harmless as they seem. I mean, if you're someone who's already on a tight budget, wouldn't this increase in spending potentially lead to more debt?
That's a crucial point. While BNPL offers flexibility, it's essential to remember that it is a form of debt. And for people who are already financially stretched, increased spending through BNPL could definitely make things worse.
That's a really good point. And the study found that the impact of BNPL wasn't the same for every shopper, right?
Exactly. Some people were more susceptible to this effect than others.
So who was most affected by this BNPL spending increase?
They found that people who typically had smaller purchases before using BNPL, maybe those who are more budget conscious, actually showed a much bigger increase in spending after they adopted BNPL.
That's so interesting because you'd think that people who are already watching their budgets would be less likely to overspend.
Right. It seems counterintuitive.
And what about people who use credit cards a lot before BNPL? Did they show a similar trend?
Yeah, actually they did. The increase in spending was also stronger for people who relied more heavily on credit cards before using BNPL, which could indicate that they're more sensitive to costs.
Okay, so it's almost like the people who are already the most concerned about their spending are the ones who are most affected by BNPL.
It's definitely a pattern worth exploring.
Absolutely. So how do we explain this? Why would someone who's already budget conscious be more likely to spend more with BNPL?
That's a fantastic question. And to get to the bottom of it, the researchers actually went beyond just analyzing data. They designed a series of experiments.
Okay, I love experiments. They always reveal such fascinating insights.
Don't they?
What were they hoping to uncover with these experiments?
Well, they wanted to understand exactly what it is about BNPL that changes how we spend money. What is it about those installment payments that makes us reach for our wallets?
Okay, so like the underlying psychological mechanisms at play.
Precisely. And their key finding was that BNPL reduces perceived financial constraints.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means that even though your actual income hasn't changed, BNPL makes you feel like you have more financial wiggle room.
So it's all about perception.
Exactly. It's like a mental trick that makes us feel more financially free.
It's amazing how powerful our minds can be. But how does it work? How does BNPL create this feeling of financial freedom?
So the study highlights 2 main mechanisms. First, it reduces perceived costs. Those smaller installments just feel less expensive, even though logically, the total price is the same.
Right. It's like when you see a gym membership advertised as just $5 a day. It sounds so much more manageable than saying it's $1,800 a year.
Exactly. It's all about framing.
So BNPL is kind of playing on that same psychological tendency.
Absolutely. And the second way BNPL creates this sense of financial freedom is through boosted budget control. Spreading out payments helps you mentally chunk your budget. It makes it easier to see how that purchase fits into your overall spending plan.
So it's like having built-in guardrails for your spending.
Exactly. And that feeling of control, that perception of having a handle on your finances, is a big part of why those feelings of financial constraint diminish.
So even though you might actually be spending more overall, BNPL makes you feel more comfortable and in control of your finances.
That's the idea.
It's fascinating how our brains can be so easily tricked.
Isn't it?
But I'm curious, is this effect limited to those everyday smaller purchases? Or does BNPL have the same power over larger one-time expenses?
That's where one of the experiments gets really interesting. They tested BNPL for booking a flight 6 weeks in advance.
Okay, so the flight itself is delayed, but you still have to pay for it.
Exactly. And even with that delayed gratification, BNPL still had an impact.
Wow. So it seems like BNPL's influence isn't limited to just those recurring smaller purchases. It can be just as tempting for those big ticket items too.
Absolutely. Which raises some interesting questions.
Like what?
Well, the study focused on how much we spend, but it didn't really delve into what we buy. Given that BNPL makes us feel less financially constrained, could it be leading us to prioritize those material wants over experiences or essential needs?
That's a good point. It's like, if I feel like I have more money to spend, maybe I'm more likely to splurge on that new gadget or that trendy jacket.
Exactly. It could be subtly shifting our values and priorities when it comes to spending.
That's a really intriguing thought. It's almost like BNPL is not just about convenience. It's about shaping our desires and our relationship with money.
It's definitely something to think about. And it highlights the need for more research in this area. We need to understand not just the financial implications of BNPL, but also its broader impact on our consumption patterns and even our well-being.
It seems like we've only just scratched the surface here.
We have. It's a complex issue with far-reaching consequences.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about the next time they see that BNPL option?
I think the most important thing is to be aware of the potential influence. Ask yourself if you're truly comfortable with the purchase and the total cost. Don't let those convenient installments cloud your judgment.
It's like having that little voice in your head saying, hold on a minute. Am I really making this decision based on what I need and can afford? Or am I being swayed by the allure of BNPL?
Exactly. Be mindful and ask those critical questions. It's the best way to stay in control of your spending and avoid falling into the trap of overspending.
I think that's excellent advice. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on this. It's been incredibly eye-opening.
My pleasure. I always enjoy these conversations.
I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear more about those experiments you mentioned.
Well, in one of the experiments, they presented people with this option to buy a water bottle.
Okay.
And they could either use BNPL or just a traditional one-time payment.
So a pretty standard everyday item.
Yeah, exactly. And what they found was really fascinating. People who were offered the BNPL option were actually more likely to say they would buy the water bottle,
even though
the total price was the same.
Yeah. So just the way the payment was structured influenced their decision.
Yeah, it's really interesting how these little changes in how things are presented can have such a big impact on our choices.
Totally. It's like you're less focused on the overall cost and more on that smaller, more manageable installment.
Exactly. And that can be really powerful.
It makes you think about all the other ways BNPL might be subtly shaping our behavior. I mean, do you think it could even influence the types of things we buy?
That's a great question. And it's definitely an area that needs more research.
Yeah.
It's possible that BNPL could lead people to buy more non-essential items or even upgrade to more expensive versions of things they need.
Right. Because if it makes us feel less financially restricted, then we might be more inclined to indulge in those little extras or opt for the premium model.
Exactly. It's all about understanding how these psychological nudges can impact our decisions, both the big ones and the small ones.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. I mean, it's amazing how much psychology is at play in something as seemingly simple as choosing a payment method.
It's true. It's a reminder that we're not always as rational as we think we are.
And that's where understanding these concepts can be so powerful. It helps us become more informed consumers.
Absolutely.
So for our listeners, what's the big takeaway here? What should they be thinking about the next time they see that BNPL option?
Well, I think the most important thing is just to be aware of the potential influence.
Okay.
Before you click that button, ask yourself, are you really comfortable with this purchase?
Yeah.
And the total cost?
Right. Don't let those convenient installments totally cloud your judgment.
Exactly. It's like having that little voice in your head saying, hold on a minute.
Right.
Am I really making this decision based on what I need and can afford? Or am I being swayed by the allure of BNPL?
I love that. It's all about being mindful and asking those critical questions.
That's the key. It's how you stay in control of your spending and avoid overspending.
Well, this has been such a valuable discussion. Thank you so much for helping us unpack all of this.
My pleasure. It's always great to chat with you about these topics.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today. But before we wrap up, is there anything else you think our listeners should know about this research or BNPL in general?
Yeah, I think one thing to add is that while this particular study focused on apparel retail, the findings probably have implications for a wide range of industries. I mean, BNPL is becoming so common.
It's everywhere.
It really is. And its influence is probably being felt across all sorts of spending categories, not just clothes.
Right. It's about how we approach all kinds of purchases, whether it's electronics or travel or even groceries.
Exactly. And as BNPL continues to evolve and new models emerge, it's going to be really interesting to see how these dynamics play out in the future.
It's definitely something to keep an eye on. So for our listeners, as you're navigating the world of online shopping and all those tempting BNPL offers, just remember what we talked about today. It's not just about convenience. It's also about psychology.
And don't be afraid to take a step back. Really assess your needs and make sure you're making informed choices that align with your financial goals.
Such good advice. This has been another fantastic deep dive. I feel so much more informed as a shopper now.
That's great to hear. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to navigating the complex world of consumerism.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to our own spending habits. I feel like we've really uncovered some hidden depths to BNPL today.
Yeah, it's not just about spreading out payments. It's about how these seemingly small changes can actually influence our behavior.
Exactly. And I think that's the biggest takeaway for everyone listening. Awareness is key.
It is. It's the first step to making those smarter, more informed decisions.
Couldn't agree more. Well, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. I know we'll be looking at those BNPL buttons with a whole new perspective now.
I think that's great. And remember, the goal isn't necessarily to avoid BNPL completely. It can be a helpful tool when used responsibly. It's all about recognizing those potential pitfalls and making conscious choices that align with your own financial goals.
Well said. A huge thank you to you for guiding us through this research. I think we've all gained a much deeper understanding of BNPL and its implications.
It was my pleasure. I always enjoy our conversations. We hope you found it insightful. If you want to dig deeper into the research yourself, we'll include a link to the full paper in the show notes.
And if you enjoyed this episode of Revise and Resubmit, be sure to subscribe to our channel on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the latest academic research.